These are the words of Genesis chapter 22. Now it came about after these things that God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham? And he said, Here I am. And he said, Take now your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I will tell you. So Abraham rose early in the morning and saddled his donkey and took 2 of his young men with him and Isaac his son. And he split wood for the burnt offering and arose and went to the place of which God had told him. On the 3rd day, Abraham raised his eyes and saw the place from a distance. And Abraham said to his young men, Stay here with the donkey, and I and the lad will go yonder. We will worship and return to you. And Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on Isaac his son. And he took in his hand the fire and the knife. So the 2 of them walked on together. And Isaac spoke to Abraham his father and said, My father. And he said, Here I am, my son. And he said, Behold, the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering? And Abraham said, God will provide for himself the lamb for the burnt offering, my son. So the 2 of them walked on together. Then they came to the place of which God had told them, and Abraham built the altar there and arranged the wood and bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. And Abraham stretched out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. And he said, Here I am. And he said, Do not stretch out your hand against the lad and do nothing to him. For now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. Then Abraham raised his eyes and looked, and behold, behind him a ram caught in the thicket by the horns. And Abraham went up and took the lamb and offered it for a burnt offering in the place of his son. And Abraham called the name of the place, The Lord will provide, as it is said to this day, In the mount of the Lord it will be provided. God had come to Abraham out of the blue before. Abraham was in Haran with his family, and the Lord spoke, Go from your country with your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you, and I will make a great nation of you and bless you. Which is what Abraham did in the days before he was renamed Abraham. God called him, God sent him. They were in and out of Egypt during a time of famine, threatened by the Pharaoh with his life because of the beauty of his wife, whom he tried to pass off as his sister, preserved in the midst of travail in foreign lands, grasped out of the hand of danger and back into the land of which God originally spoke, because God called him and God sent him. Through a season in Sodom with his nephew Lot, bargaining with God for the lives of the righteous, seeing the whole thing go up in flames, Sodom and Gomorrah, God called Abraham and God sent him. God promised him descendants as numerous as the sand on the seashore. Abraham and Sarah did not receive a child immediately or even very soon, but eventually, at a time in life when they were probably the objects of derision, they did have a son. His name was Isaac. Ironically, laughter, because Sarah laughed, thinking to have a child at my age. They were very old. But through all of this, God did not lead Abraham astray. He called him, and he sent him. By now, God returns out of the blue. In the passage we read today, the words are much, much harder. They seem to arise from nowhere. Take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains I will show you. Abraham gets part of this. He's being sent. He goes to the mountain. Interesting that God does not identify the mountain, but then God did not identify the land to which they would go either until they arrived. God would make sure of that. And he gets the part of worship too. Worship is all important for what they do. Abraham was an altar builder. His first altar was somewhere between Bethel and Ai on the road to Negev, in a land where you didn't have churches and synagogues and temples and other places of worship. You created altars. They were at places where something holy had happened. Abraham would have understood the call to worship. But this wasn't merely about a mountain and worship. God took Abraham's faith, his trust in God, and his understanding of the future to an entirely new level. Take your beloved son, not the son Ishmael, the expendable son, whom you've already sent off, but take your beloved son, Isaac, on whom the whole future of your people depends. Take your only son, Isaac, whom you love, and make of him a burnt offering. God called Abraham. God sent Abraham. I don't believe through the years I have struggled with any portion of Scripture as I have with this one. God seems to be asking of Abraham the worst and ultimate kind of child abuse. And if we say, but God didn't let him go through with it, one might make the case that God was playing games with Abraham. Not to mention the utter psychological damage you inflict on Isaac, who was, of those four early patriarchs, easily the weakest. And what if you are Sarah? Mothers, out there, what are you thinking? She may have thought, Abraham, you may have thought God was sending you. Hebrew legend has it that when Sarah got word of what was happening, she died. I say to you, unless you feel the deep personal pain of these individuals, you don't get this chapter. Unless you are faced with the prospect of death out of season and sequence, you're not going to get it. Abraham is faced with the end of life as he knows it. If Isaac dies, what's next? He's facing the future, which is a blank wall. Is it possible that all of this rendered him mute? Is that why he does not speak? Is that why he's like Zacharias, who, when the angel of God came to and said, you're going to have a son? Yet Abraham was called and sent. Abraham muddles through. Maybe he lays his worst fears aside. Perhaps he stiffens his upper lip. It's hard to imagine his doing that as the two of them, Isaac and Abraham, walk on together alone. He's a better man than I, this Abraham. I couldn't have done this. I don't think I would have done this. But God called Abraham and God sent him. They arrive at the mountain. The Hebrews call this the Acedia, which is the Hebrew term for binding. The word is found in the 10th verse, and it comes at a critical moment. Abraham is preparing his son Isaac, whom he loves, to be a sacrifice to God. In so doing, he binds him to the altar. Hebrew tradition tells us in this story that Isaac, in obedience to the father, told him to bind him tight so he would not struggle through the sacrifice and ruin it. This is the point of no return. And the father does not flinch. After all, God called Abraham. God sent him. The story is spare in detail. We do not know what emotions must have coursed through Abraham's mind. He does not converse with God as he does in some other episodes. We do not know what misgivings, doubts, or second thoughts he may have had. Incredibly, he had just sent off his first son, Ishmael, to clear the way for Isaac. And now, this sacrifice seems to destroy the rest of the future. We just know that Abraham stood faithful, doing what he believed God had called him to do, because he was called, because he was sent. We don't always know what we are going to do. We may think we know what we would do under given circumstances. We are rich in imagination about what we would do if we were in somebody else's shoes. We don't always know what we'll do. We play it by ear. Better, we hope we play it by faith. For Abraham, it was a flashpoint of faith. He raises his hand. with the shining blade of the knife glistening in the sun for all the world. This looks like the end. It looks like death. But Abraham was called and sent. Yet miraculously, the story ends in life because we've read the story. We know what happens. We don't know why it happens, except that God intervenes because God called Abraham and God sent Abraham, and now God blesses Abraham. Something miraculous happens on Mount Moriah. Now, we're not on Mount Moriah. We're on Winstanley Hill, and I get that. None of us is Abraham and none of us is Isaac, but as in the story of Abraham with the knife raised over his son, we encounter moments of decision. You might say, here we are, Lord, knife raised, glistening in the sun. We've not been asked to kill a son, nor have we been asked to answer a son's question, where is the sacrifice? We haven't been asked to bind him on the altar, to offer up a life in the image of God. That is not our situation. But we are called to make great leaps of faith. As followers of Jesus, we are called to walk to the faith edge of the precipice. Our goal in life is not comfort. Our modus operandi is not the way of least resistance. We are called and we are sent. Ours are lives of faith. We find ourselves at one such moment, Winstanley. I've been looking around the hill and talking with you. In some ways, I believe God has given us more momentum right now than I can recall. New members, guests. Right now, more than any time I can recall, you are inviting your friends to Winstanley. I am having more opportunities to talk to people about faith than I can recall. As a church, we're beginning to take advantage of some of the real opportunities. Go look at the preschool. Check out social media. Did you see how many young people we dedicated during November and December? And then today. This is the kind of thing that's happening. What to do? It came down to a church business meeting last year and one question: is this the time to look for and call a new staff member to help us take advantage of the momentum? Specifically, to look for somebody who can do student ministry and education ministry full time. Long discussion. In fact, the longest business meeting I have presided over in 40 years. And yet, not only was it civil, it was constructive. We finally acknowledged it would undoubtedly be a challenge to fund the position, but we said yes to starting a search for the person. I appointed a committee after that church vote, and that committee has been working diligently. We don't have a candidate to present, not yet, stay tuned. But one thing we needed to do was to make sure we had the funding in place before we negotiated with him. We had to agree to that financial framework before we bring him to you, which is why you see the jump in the proposed budget. I have to say that if we make the only question, how are we going to pay for it, we will have to answer, I'm not sure. But if the question is, has God given us an opportunity we must take advantage of, we may get an entirely different answer. Are we willing to go to Mount Moriah, trusting that there's a ram in the thicket? Now, we don't see the ram in the thicket yet. We may not see him coming. We may not even hear him. But when he comes, we may look at each other and say, how did that ram get here? Surely it could not have walked past me while I was standing here at the altar, could it? Did it? But when you act in faith, only God sets the limits. We have to decide, are we called? Are we sent for such a time as this? I believe we are. I have a story. I wish it were my story. It's preacher Will Williman's story. And on a day when we talk about being called and sent, I think he nails it. Here's how it goes. He says, at the age of 10, I was minding my business, doing time in Mrs. McDaniel's 6th grade class when I got the call. Williman, Mr. Harrelson, the intimidating ancient principal, says he wants to see you. Go to the office. At age 10, minding my business, I trudged to the principal's office, ascending the gallows, and went over every possible reason he could be wanting to see me. I mean, I saw the rock go through that window, but I didn't throw it, and I really wasn't even part of that. He said, listen clearly. I don't intend to repeat myself. You go down Tyndall 2 blocks and turn left, go 2 more blocks to number 15. I need a message delivered. You tell Jimmy Spain's mother if he's not in school by this afternoon, I'm going to report her to the police for truancy. So it wasn't about me. It was worse. God help me. Jimmy Spain, toughest thug of all in the 6th grade. He was a 6th grader who should have been in the 8th grade. And what was truancy? Pondering all these thoughts, I journeyed down Tyndall, bidding farewell to the safety of the schoolyard. Turned left, went 2 more blocks, marveling that the world actually went on doing all kinds of things while we were in school. And then I descended into a not too nice neighborhood. What was left of a sad location behind the school. Number 15 was a small house, peeling paint, disordered yard. Just the sort of house you'd expect Jimmy Spain to be holed up in. Rough looking, small, sinister. There was a big Buick parked in front. As I fearfully approached the walk, a man emerged, letting the door slam, stepping off the porch, adjusting his tie, pulling on his cord, and I approached him and said, "Are you Mr. Spain, sir?" Just then I remembered that everybody at school said that Jimmy was so mean because he didn't have a daddy. The man looked down at me, pulled his tie tight, and guffawed. "Mr. Spain?" Ha! Laughing, he left me standing there, got into his car, and sped off. I had to wait until 8th grade to learn when somebody whispered to me the dirty word for what Jimmy's mother did for a living. I stepped up the rotten porch and knocked on the door, and my heart sank when it was opened by none other than Jimmy Spain, whose steely eyes stared straight through me. Before he could say anything, the door was pulled open more widely, and there stood his mother in a terry cloth bathrobe looking at me over Jimmy's shoulder. "What do you want?" she asked in a cold, threatening tone, as I marveled at the sight of a woman in her bathrobe at midday. I'm from school. The principal sent me to. "The principal? What does that old fool want?" Well, he sent me to say that everybody at school misses Jimmy and wishes he were here today. "What?" she sneered, pulling Jimmy to her. "It's like a special day and everybody wants Jimmy there." I'm pretty sure that's what they said. Jimmy, the feared thug who could have beat up any of the 9th graders if he had wanted to at Donaldson's school, peered out at me, suddenly looking quite small and insignificant in his mother's arm. "Well, you tell that old man that it's none of his business what I do with James." "James," she said, looking down at him, "do you want to go to that old school today or not?" Jimmy looked at Williman wordlessly and nodded assent. In a flash, he was away and back. His mother stood at the door, stood staring at them as they walked down the porch, down the walk, back toward Tyndall Avenue, and as they walked the few blocks back to school, said not a word to each other. We walked up the steps to the school, took a right, and wordlessly turned toward the principal's office. I led him, handed him to the principal's secretary, who received my ward, and for the first time, Jimmy seemed not so threatening, not so mean, but actually very small. As the secretary led him away, Jimmy turned to me and looked at me with embarrassment, or could it have been gratitude? That evening, when I narrated this whole story to my mother at supper, she said, "That is the most outrageous thing I have ever heard. Sending a young child out in the middle of the day to fetch a truant, and on that street, Mr. Harrelson ought to have his head examined. Don't you allow anyone to ever put you in that position again, sending a child." But Williman says, even then, I knew my mother was wrong. That day was the best day of my life at Donaldson School. Preparation for the rest of my life, for my first experience of God who thinks of nothing of commandeering ordinary folk and handing them outrageous assignments. That day, walking down Tyndall Avenue was a dress rehearsal for the night 2 decades later, when I knelt at the front of the church for ordination and had hands laid on me and heard pronounced, "You go down Tyndall 2 blocks, turn left, go to seminary, study hard, and I'll send you a church where the people need to hear a message, because I have a message to be delivered." Amen. What do you think? We've been called. We've been sent.